Judas Iscariot, a figure known in history for his betrayal, met a tragic end when he died of asphyxiation caused by hanging. This death was marked by his body falling on his head, or according to some accounts, by a swelling so extreme that it eventually led to his body exploding. If we had the opportunity to go back in time and ask this question of Christians living in the 1st century, at the very dawn of Christianity, we might expect to hear a variety of answers. However, when we analyze the texts that make up the New Testament, we come across 2 of these possible versions on the subject. In addition, there is a 3rd version that circulated quite famously, although it is not part of the biblical canon. So let's explore in detail what each of these versions says and, at the same time, we'll examine how the ancients understood and tried to harmonize the different accounts of Judas' death, trying to understand the interpretations of this episode. To begin with, we can emphasize the first version, which can be considered the most famous of all those that exist, being the one recorded in Matthew's Gospel. This version is of such notoriety that undoubtedly many people recognize it immediately, given its relevance and historical impact. As described in this Gospel, the priests had offered Judas the sum of 30 pieces of silver so that he would hand Jesus over. However, after witnessing the entire trial process and the condemnation of his master, Judas ended up experiencing an intense feeling of deep guilt and regret for his actions, didn't he? Judas, in a moment of intense reflection and pain, ended up experiencing a deep sense of remorse for his actions. He decided to return to the temple, determined to return the coins he had received as payment for his betrayal. However, when he arrived at the holy place, the priests were reluctant and refused to accept the money back. Faced with this refusal, Judas, overcome with despair, threw the coins to the ground in a gesture of despair and then left in search of a tragic fate, choosing to hang himself. Faced with this situation, the people who had given the coins to Judas made a significant decision. As the coins in question represented what is referred to as the price of blood, as mentioned in the text, this refers to the use of that money to facilitate the condemnation to death of a person. Thus, since it was a value associated with an extremely immoral act, these people realized that they could not, under any circumstances, deposit this money in the sacred treasury. This decision reflects their moral awareness of the inappropriate use of financial resources. However, these people had the possibility of using the coins they had to buy land, and this is exactly what they decided to do, calling these places the Potter's Field. They used these acquired areas as a kind of sepulchre for people of foreign origin. Therefore, due to this specific use of the land, as mentioned in the text, these areas ended up being recognized by the name of Bloodfield. This is not the only narrative we can find in the Holy Scriptures about the death of Judas, since there are other versions that also deal with this subject. What's more, it's not the only justification for the name of this place, known as the Field of Blood. This reference occurs in the Book of Acts of the Apostles, which recounts events that took place after the death and subsequent resurrection of Jesus Christ. A striking situation unfolds in which the Apostle Peter stands before a large crowd made up of hundreds of other disciples. At this significant moment, he takes on the responsibility of delivering an important speech, in which he clarifies the need to select a new member who can replace Judas Iscariot. This becomes essential if the number of apostles, who were part of Jesus' inner circle, is to be restored to 12, since, due to Judas' death, they had been reduced to just 11. During his speech, Peter discusses Judas' last days, reflecting on his actions and the circumstances that led to his downfall. It is in this context that he expresses his ideas and concerns about the future of the community. Peter mentions, as recorded in the Book of Acts, that Judas, after committing the betrayal against Jesus, used the money earned from his iniquity, referring to the coins he received for betraying the master, to buy a field. According to narratives, it was on this piece of land that Judas abruptly fell, resulting in his tragically violent death, where his body was torn in half and his entrails ended up spilling out onto the ground, in a somber scene that reveals the consequences of his betrayal. This is a scene that is actually quite strange and intriguing to visualize, especially when we try to understand how it happened from a cinematic point of view. From the moment Judas finds himself in a situation that results in his body being torn in half after falling on his head, it's a process that raises many questions. However, we will return to this subject with a more in-depth analysis later on. Before continuing with Peter's speech, it's important to emphasize that he also mentions this specific event. Judas' death, which happened in such a way, became so notorious that all the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem came to know the place where he died as Asaldama, which in their language means field of blood. This name reflects the seriousness and notoriety that surrounded the event in question. Thus, according to the narrative found in the Book of Acts, Judas Iscariot, the traitor, did not return the amount of money he had received for his betrayal to the priests of the temple. As a direct consequence of this action, the priests also did not buy any land using the money. So it's plausible to say that, regardless of who bought the land afterwards, at least it wasn't bought with the money Judas had received, right? Secondly, the author of the book of Acts of the Apostles mentions that Peter reports that it was exactly Judas who met his death on that piece of land. And this information is presented in a way that can be considered somewhat enigmatic, can't it? He fell on his head and, for a reason that isn't clear, his body split into two parts. After that fall, right? The fight that took place at this historic event was so violent and full of blood that the place in question came to be known as the Field of Blood, a name that refers to the amount of bloodshed that took place there. This is a different explanation to that found in the Gospel of Matthew, which also seeks to elucidate the meaning of the region's name. In a future post, we'll look at how various authors throughout history, from ancient times onwards, have tried to offer their interpretations of these discrepancies. However, before we go any further down this road, it is essential that we discuss one of the most impressive versions of all regarding the death of Judas, which, in my view, is the most remarkable version. This particular account was recorded by an extremely ancient Christian leader, who may even have lived with the Apostle John. The figure in question refers to Papias of Hierapolis, a personality who lived between the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era. He is cited by Irenaeus of Lyon, an important bishop, as an individual belonging to the early period of Christianity and as someone who had the privilege of directly hearing the teachings of the first elders of the Christian faith. This means that Papias had access to accounts of the events surrounding the life of Jesus Christ, received directly from people who were present in the circumstances of the time, including, it is believed, a certain John, which many scholars interpret as an allusion to the Apostle John, one of Jesus' closest disciples. This connection provides a significant link between Papias and the origins of the early Christian tradition. Papias, one of the first Christian writers, provides us with information about the death of Judas Iscariot. It's important to note that there are two distinct accounts of this event, a more concise version and another that presents a more detailed account. Papias is known for having produced a comprehensive work called Exposition of the Words of the Lord, which consisted of 5 volumes. This work, although it was much quoted and referenced by various ancient authors, was not so fortunate as the preservation of its manuscripts. Thus, no copy of it has survived to the present day. Even though Papias' text is no longer available, its content and ideas continue to be studied and discussed thanks to mentions made by other writers of the time. Thus, we can say that there are certain passages preserved over time, which are quoted in various works that have withstood the passage of time. A notable example is Papias' account of the death of Judas, which is recorded in 2 ways, a more concise version and a more elaborate one, both of which are referenced by Bishop Apollinaris of Laodicea, who lived in the 1st century. What is presented in the brief version of Papias' account is quite striking, as it describes a bloated Judas being brutally run over by a cart, resulting in his entrails being scattered all over the place. On the other hand, in the more extensive version of this event, the trampling itself is not mentioned, but several grotesque details are added that vividly illustrate the last days of Judas' life, bringing up images that can be considered quite repulsive. So, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, we suggest you go to the chapter section in the video description and move on to the next topic. Okay, so let's get to it. According to Papias' long version, what happened was as follows. Judas swelled up completely, just like in the short version, and his head swelled to such an extent that it was wider than a wagon and he couldn't see anything because his eyes were basically buried by that mass that had turned his head. Not even doctors with specialized instruments could access his eyes, such was the degree of inflammation. The swelling of his body and, worse, his genital organ also, swelled tremendously, and every time he went to relieve himself, pus and worms came out along with the urine, and he remained in this state for some time, suffering tremendously, and, finally, he died. And Papias makes a point of specifying where he died. He died, open inverted commas, on his own land, close inverted commas. Right? That is, on his property, the property he bought. And that property has been completely deserted and uninhabitable ever since because of the unbearable odor of the putrid secretion that was expelled from Judas' body and that seeped into the ground. The text mentions that, to date, not a single person has been able to cross over, hasn't it? At the time the text was written, there was no permission for anyone to approach that specific land. So we can identify the different versions of Papias, and it's important to emphasize at least 2 aspects that deserve special attention in relation to these versions. The first point to emphasize is that, once again, the issue involving the death of Judas Iscariot is associated with the elucidation of an aspect that concerns a particular plot or piece of land. In this place, what is really elucidated by the narrative is not precisely the name of the territory, but rather the fragrance of the land or, more broadly, its general condition of helplessness and neglect. Although these accounts may seem rather strange and even surreal, in reality they are not very different from other writings we have already encountered in similar contexts. These texts, despite their peculiarities, share certain characteristics with well-known works, showing that the way we perceive and describe the environment around us can follow common patterns, even with the variations that may exist. In several passages, such as the narrative describing the death of Antiochus IV, which can be found in the second book of the Maccabees, there are striking similarities with the death of King Herod, which is presented in the works of Flavius Josephus, as well as with the death of the Emperor Galerius, as reported by Eusebius of Caesarea. In all these passages that deal with the death of figures considered to be evil, the corpses of these characters similarly swell up in a grotesque way, give rise to worms, and are full of ulcers and have sores in the intestines and viscera. These individuals therefore find the end of their lives in extremely repulsive circumstances. In all these cases, the divine punishment inflicted on these personalities occurs in a way that is characterized by an extremely unpleasant and physically repugnant death. So, if anyone is interested in accessing the descriptions directly, it's very simple. Just rewind the video to the previous parts and pause the playback the moment the texts become visible on the screen. So these represent the different versions attributed to Papias, don't they? As you can see, there are clear differences between them, which make them distinct from each other. One of the narratives presents being run over as the reason for the death, while the other tells a story that clearly differs from the version found in Acts. This, in turn, is also distorted in relation to the account in Matthew's Gospel. If you're wondering how to justify these discrepancies, it's important to know that this isn't the first time this doubt has been raised, since these variations have been recognized since ancient times. Various authors throughout history have dedicated themselves to trying to create a clearer articulation between these versions, and there have even been efforts to combine more than one of them, bringing them together in a single narrative, as is the case with the book by Apollinaris of Laodicea. This author mentions the versions presented by Papias and makes it clear that these narratives do not contradict the account in Matthew's Gospel, nor do they contradict each other. Do you agree? According to his analysis, the issue at stake is that the Gospel of Matthew only mentions that Judas withdrew to commit suicide by hanging, but does not provide a categorical statement that he actually carried out this act of hanging himself. What Apollinaris suggests is that Judas did find himself in a situation where he tried to take his own life by hanging himself, but someone intervened at this critical moment, cutting the rope and thus preventing him from dying in this tragic way. As a result, Judas was able to carry on with his life in the usual way and subsequently continue to exist. Correct? At a different time, all these experiences and situations that the popes describe and share happened to him, didn't they? The act of lynching, along with other equally grotesque actions, sparked attempts at synthesis on the part of St. Augustine and St. Jerome, who endeavored to bring together various narratives into a single cohesive story. However, it should be emphasized that the versions they sought to unite in fact belong to the Gospel of Matthew and the book of the Acts of the Apostles. In this context, they claim that Judas, after committing the betrayal, would have forced himself and consequently broken in half, bringing this peculiar interpretation to light. Recently, several interpreters have suggested a new perspective on Judas, proposing the hypothesis that he tried to hang himself, but unfortunately the rope used for the act broke. This tragic outcome would have led Judas to a painful fall, in which his body plummeted from a significant height, resulting in such a devastating impact when he hit the ground that his body would have fragmented, with part of it shattering due to the force of the shock. This situation, it seems, was analyzed and resolved precisely, finding an appropriate outcome for what happened. The initial question that arises concerns how Judas, in an inverted position, either hanging with his body turned to the right or in a completely upside-down position, managed to actually fall so far that he was upside down. What exactly happened to cause him to rotate in the air? Furthermore, what are the odds that, during the fall, he would have managed to find a branch that was located right on the edge of a cliff, so that the height of the fall would have been great enough to cause his body to separate into two parts? Thus, the logistics involved in this hanging situation seem to present a series of complications and difficulties. In addition to everything that has already been mentioned, if in fact the full story is that Judas hanged himself, but the rope broke and he ended up dying as a result of the fall, and not because of the hanging itself, then the question arises, why do each of the authors choose to relate only fragments of this story? Why is it that the author of the Gospel of Matthew mentions nothing in his scriptures about a fall, while the author of the book of Acts makes no mention of the hanging in his accounts? This lack of information may raise questions about the narrative choices of each of these sacred writers. It is curious to consider that although both texts belong to the same religious and historical context, their approaches differ in the way events are narrated or omitted. What motivated each author to leave out these particular elements? Nowadays, it's quite common to find different types of texts gathered together in a single volume, isn't it? The New Testament, so that any contemporary reader who takes the time to read the Gospel of Matthew can, without difficulty, understand the complete unfolding of the narrative, so to speak, can't they? The theme involving the description of a body that falls and explodes occurs just after the moment when the reading reaches the book of Acts. However, it's essential to emphasize that, historically, these texts were for many centuries, or even millennia, circulated mostly independently. This means that not everyone who had the opportunity to access a copy of Matthew's Gospel, obtained directly from its original source, also had a copy of the book of Acts. It is important to emphasize that these two books existed separately and autonomously before the New Testament was conceived as a whole. Therefore, what can be concluded is that the connection between them was not so immediate, showing a division in time and access to this sacred knowledge. Initially, these books were not included in the set we know as the New Testament. Each one existed independently, as distinct and autonomous works. Later, the decision was made to bring all these texts together and organize them into a single collection, which now makes up the New Testament. Although what we mentioned above happened, when we examine the manuscripts of biblical texts that were discovered in antiquity and also those from the Middle Ages, we come across a diversity of manuscripts that, for example, contain only the Gospels. A clear example of this situation is the presence of a collection that contains the Gospels but does not include the book of Acts. This raises the question of whether we should read the Gospel of Matthew first and then the other Gospels, right? After reading the Gospels, the practice of reading the book of Acts of the Apostles is not a common activity, and this reading behavior has not spread widely throughout most of history. In fact, there is no indication to suggest that the author of the book of Acts assumed that his readers had already read the Gospel of Matthew or that they were somehow doing so simultaneously, or anything along those lines, correct? Once again, we are referring to different literary works, written by different authors, which circulated considerably independently. In other words, each of them stood out on its own in different contexts. Oh, and there's an additional detail that should also be mentioned, right? Even if this harmonization is accepted, which, it must be said, is extremely unlikely from both a physical and narrative perspective, a considerable dilemma remains. This dilemma involves the difficulty of reconciling the various interpretations related to the name of the land known as the Field of Blood. The question that arises is this place named after the blood-stained money, which refers to the immoral financial resource that Judas Iscariot returned to the priests? Or is the designation of the Field of Blood due to the fact that Judas lost his life on this land, and consequently the priests acquired the property with the intention of turning it into a cemetery to bury the dead? Alternatively, we could consider the hypothesis that it was Judas who bought the land to establish his dwelling there, couldn't we? This complexity makes the subject quite intriguing. The question that arises is, did Judas really return the coins he received or not? In this sense, from my perspective, there is a much clearer interpretation of the phenomenon of there being three different accounts of Judas' death. The interpretation I propose is as follows. These various books deal with the subject, don't they? The Gospel according to Matthew and the book of Acts of the Apostles were written by different authors, and both texts are only transmitting traditions that are, in fact, different from each other. As far as Papias of Hierapolis is concerned, the situation is similar, isn't it? It's possible that various accounts of Judas' death were already in circulation at the time the corresponding texts were written, and each of the authors decided to document these versions in their own particular way. The edition you knew, or the one that was your favorite, or the one you were convinced was the most truthful, right? If they were familiar with more than one option, that's certainly feasible too, isn't it? Why not consider that it was precisely they who developed these versions with the intention of affirming or validating some specific theological point, right? Surely there was some specific message they wanted to communicate, wasn't there? With regard to Papias' version, for example, it's important to note that we've already analyzed how this version fits in quite well with a certain tradition that attributes deaths that are considered physically repulsive, characterized by swelling and a strong smell of worms, to certain figures who were perceived as opponents in the sacred narrative, correct? So these people were subjected to this punishment that is considered exemplary, isn't it? Perceptibly surprising and impactful. As far as Matthew's version of the Gospel is concerned, there is an intention to establish a link between the figure of Judas Iscariot and the figure of Ahithophel. Ahithophel is a character mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in the Old Testament, and was known for being a close counselor to King David, notable for his wisdom and, at the same time, for his betrayals. It's interesting to note, in this context, how this comparison can enrich the interpretation of Judas' actions, who also betrayed a central figure in Christian tradition, similar to the way Ahithophel turned against David at crucial moments in his reign. And after committing treason against this king, he ended up hanging himself, didn't he? In fact, he's the only character who appears in every passage of the Bible and carries out this specific action, isn't he? In the narrative found in the biblical version according to Matthew, it is correct to say that Judas Iscariot, after betraying Jesus Christ, ends up hanging himself. This tragic decision by the traitor is a key element in the story, reflecting the despair and regret that overwhelmed him after his betrayal. So yes, the statement about Judas hanging, as mentioned in Matthew, is correct. Consequently, this opens up the possibility of establishing a parallel that is deliberately drawn. By establishing a deliberate parallel between the two narratives, by granting Judas a death that bears a resemblance to that of David the betrayer, the author not only makes a comparison, but also strengthens that theological link that has a profound meaning between the figures of David and Jesus, doesn't he? A new version of David, the benevolent Messiah. And, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it is necessary that we now address, in order to conclude the discussion about Judas' mysterious death, a fact that is presented in the book of Acts. In this account, it is mentioned that he falls upside down and breaks in half, which makes this description quite enigmatic and intriguing. This is because the text that describes this situation doesn't offer any information indicating that he fell from a considerable height or from some other high place that could justify such an outcome, correct? The representation of Judas Iscariot falling off a cliff is actually based on references that appeared long after the event itself. The account contained in the book of Acts of the Apostles merely states that Judas was in a field when he fell upside down, resulting in the explosion of his body, which, already decomposing and in a state of putrefaction, emitted a strong odor. This description is corroborated by Papias, a historian of the time, which has led some scholars to theorize that the original text present in the book of Acts may have undergone some kind of alteration over time, possibly due to errors during the copying of the manuscripts. The Greek expression meaning to fall upside down, which translates as prins genomenos, is very similar to the expression indicating to become swollen, which is the Greek word pristegenomen. This similarity leads experts to suggest that the original phrase could have been the latter, which was distorted or corrupted at some point during the transmission of the texts. It is interesting to note that there are, in fact, historical manuscripts that present the version with pris genominus, which specifically addresses this issue of Judas' body swelling. However, the great challenge lies in the texts that feature this variant, since the question that arises here is that there are texts that feature this variation, right? The phenomenon known as the swelling of Judas relates in a very pertinent way to the narrative proposed by Papias. It's important to note that these texts belong to the 10th century and later, indicating their historical relevance. In addition, the manuscripts that we have been able to access that deal with the Book of Acts date from the same period. In other words, they are also from the 10th century or later. Among these ancient records, there is a version that presents a situation in which Judas falls upside down, an interpretation that, at first glance, may seem less logical or coherent. However, it is essential to recognize that this is, in fact, the most remote evidence we have available. So it's clear that it's quite complicated to resolve this issue, isn't it? I'm sorry, but I don't have access to information about the original text you're referring to. However, I am here to help with any other requests you may have, such as rephrasing, summarizing, or clarifying texts you provide. Feel free to share the text you want me to paraphrase. The question that arises for reflection is whether the scribes who worked during the Middle Ages were, in fact, carrying out an acritic correction of the content by transforming the expression prins genomenos into preste genomenos, or whether, in reality, they were just manipulating the meaning of the original text. This doubt opens up a field of discussion about the role of scribes, who were responsible for copying and preserving documents of the time, and how the changes they implemented could affect the understanding of the cultural and intellectual legacy of that period. It is therefore pertinent to investigate whether these changes reflected an intention to improve or whether, on the contrary, they led to a distortion of the original message contained in the writings. What these people believed the text contained was actually compromising the integrity of the original text, wasn't it? Therefore, this is a problem that remains without a conclusive definition within the research related to this subject. What we can say with greater conviction is that, since the dawn of history, various versions of Judas' death began to circulate effectively, two of which are recorded in books. In addition, we could discuss other accounts of Judas' death that differ from the known version and that emerged in later periods. One example is the intriguing version contained in the Gospel of Nicodemus, which reports that Judas committed suicide by hanging after the resurrection of a chicken that was being cooked by his wife. Another interesting account, which refers to Judas himself, is found in the Gospel of Judas. In this text, he has a revealing vision that warns him of what will happen to him when he realizes that the other disciples are planning to persecute and stone him. It's worth noting that these narratives are part of the apocryphal Gospels, which are not included in the traditional biblical canon. I sincerely thank you for attending this presentation and hope to see you again next time.